That's okay. We can carry on with just audio if you want to.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's no way around it. Google's suppression in action. But I wanted to hear your thoughts. One thing that I thought people would be very interested to hear, because I know one of your slogans, I believe, or one thing that you've said before is why not vote for a real Indian as opposed to Elizabeth Warren, of course, saying that she's Native American, which we know is not apparently actually true. She actually did show up at that tribal council meeting for the Native American tribes of the United States. A few days ago, I can remember seeing.
Is that better? I just
there,
got right back in. There we go. Sorry about that. Can you see video now?
Yep, I can see it now.
Okay, sorry about that. Yep.
All right, perfect. But she was talking about, she wasn't on the rolls to address the tribal council, and people were joking about it because, of course, she's the only person in the legislature who actually claimed Native American heritage. She did end up, though, showing up unexpectedly and then reaming Trump on his use of the term Pocahontas. Actually, I was wondering what your thoughts were about that entire fiasco, because I think if we think of Elizabeth Warren, unless you're a Democrat and you're a fan of her, probably the best thing that you know about her is her row with Trump, honestly.
Yeah, well, look, here's a reality. Elizabeth Warren is a racist. And this may be hard for people like Jared Holt or Media Matters or essentially the liberal racist to understand, but she is fundamentally the racist. Look, when I look at this whole issue, I have a very different view as a journey of a low-caste Indian guy who came from India with nothing and went through the American journey and have great respect for this country. In India, my mom said you could get discriminated 9 different ways. In America, 3. But if you worked hard, which was a principle of meritocracy and the rule of law, that's why a lot of immigrants came here, Sticks, because meritocracy and the rule of law is what makes this country great. And that's why a lot of people come here. Now, if you look at Elizabeth Warren, here's a woman who used race for her own benefit. Racism is not someone, in my opinion, calling you the N-word or calling you all sorts of other names. That's ignorance. That's not racism. Racism is people who have access to massive amounts of capital, assets, and influence who use race or use race to their benefit. That's what a racist is by the classic, in my view, the fundamental, foundational definition of it. That's what Elizabeth Warren is. Here's a woman who knows about affirmative action, which was a gain of the civil rights movement, albeit it's not perfect, but it was a bone that the Democrats threw to people out on the streets to calm them down. But regardless, affirmative action was a policy that was set in place to help everyday people who were, in some ways, you could argue, diminished. Well, Elizabeth Warren used that, lied on her Harvard application, and shoplifted Native American identity to get in. And then when she's called out on it, she uses racism again and calls Trump racist. This is the epitome of racism, and this is a level of hubris people who occupy, what I call the sewer that feeds a swamp in DC, which is Harvard University, do. So it's a massive level of racism. And look, I've lived in India, I've lived here, I grew up in Patterson, predominantly African-American, I grew up in working class neighborhoods. When I look at Massachusetts as a whole and the 1 mile radius around Harvard University, that is the center of racism, exploitation, and the military industrial academic complex. That's what Elizabeth Warren represents. If anything, she is a face of the deep state. She's got Harvard on one hand, which is part of the academic complex. She supports Monsanto, one of the most evil companies. She sits on the Armed Services Committee. She actually sent back weapons which were denied by Chuck Hagel, right? I mean, by the military. So you're talking about someone who's what I call the not so obvious establishment. To all the liberals listening out there, listen carefully. You're looking at the kind of person who you guys claim you want to help, the poor darky, right? Well, I'm here. I've done well. And I'm the one who, in many ways, deserves a right to represent the people of Massachusetts. It's a state of innovators. It's a state of people who work hard. And it's a state of meritocracy. Elizabeth Warren, Harvard claims it's all about meritocracy, but she cut in line. And that's why people like Elizabeth Warren also want illegal immigrants to cut in line. Right now, if you look at the bill that's in Congress, it fundamentally says that 1.8 million illegal immigrants and cut in line ahead of roughly 1.5 legal immigrants who've been waiting in line some 10, 20 years for their visa applications, et cetera. So this is a policy of Elizabeth Warren and essentially what I call the left wing of the establishment, right? Which is what the Democratic Party is. They're used to manipulate the people on the street to drive them back into the establishment. Same with a guy like Bernie Sanders, etc.
And in the last few weeks, as a run-up to the idea of the left really representing sort of the racism or bigotry within the United States in the way that they use people like pawns, would you say that that extends as well to sexism? Because I know in the last couple of weeks, we've had a number of left-leaning media sites that have been embroiled in scandals involving, I believe it was Vice Media, Vice News is a subsidiary of theirs, and pay discrimination. There is at least one lawsuit going on at the Young Turks. There have been other problems as well, to the point at which some people have quit their jobs in protest on these topics. Would you say that it goes beyond racism and it goes into bigotry in general? The use, essentially, of wedges that can be driven in between groups of people to try to carve out 51% of a voting bloc. Would you say that that's primarily been a liberal tactic, at least in maybe the post-Carter Reagan era?
Yeah, look, when you really look at globalism, or what I call imperialism, the two pillars that the globalists and the imperialists use to divide up people are racism and sexism / feminism, right? And they're very, very clever about this, because the reality is there is, let's say, oppression of people of color. There is oppression of women. Okay, that exists. But what these guys do is they use a very insidious form of pointing racism and feminism. So on racism, they never address the issue of the majority of poor blacks, by the way, which are very similar to the extent of poor whites in this country. No one discusses that either, right? The mortality rates of poor whites have gone up significantly over anyone else in the world right now. But poor whites and poor blacks as a group are pitted against each other. So we never discuss the fact, look, Jay-Z and Oprah Winfrey have very little to do with poor blacks, right? So they use race in a very clever way to manipulate poor whites and poor blacks, who essentially have the same enemy, which is the establishment. On the other hand, when it comes to feminism, these people are really talking about bourgeois feminism, right? They want more people like Hillary Clinton, more people like Martha Stewart, more people like Meryl Streep. They're not talking about everyday women who, in Elizabeth Warren's own staff, I think she was paying people less than 70% equivalent to the male counterpart. So they don't want to discuss the issue of the American worker, black or white, women or male. So they love pitting men against women, black against white, because that gives them this false narrative that they are fighting for the black man, they're fighting for women, when it's all BS. What they're really fighting for is the control of votes and control of manipulating, large masses of people, women, blacks, to come to their side. Elizabeth Warren, has, her life that she operates now has nothing to do with ordinary women or ordinary people of color or everyday white people. She's talking about her bourgeois clan, her elites at Harvard, and that set of people. She's completely disconnected from the mass of the American working people.
Now, you dared to criticize both Oprah Winfrey and people associated with the left and sort of that identity politics. So a lot of people are going to look at your candidacy. Some people would see, well, he claims to be independent, but he sounds a lot like a Republican. In order to dissuade them from this view, what would you say about maybe some Republicans who honestly have done the same thing over time? Maybe a John McCain, a Mitt Romney, who of course has abandoned Massachusetts. He left behind his car elevator, and now he wants to pretend that he's been roughing it in the Southwest, making a salsa farm or something. What would you say about Republicans like that? Are they fundamentally similar in your estimation?
Yeah, I mean, Sticks, you bring up a great point. If when I look at political dynamics, I'm a deep student of this, and I've studied with people like Chomsky. I've studied, caste systems. People, Chomsky is considered a leftist. But one of the most important things, whether you look at the whole arc of political histories, there's three dynamics that come out. And I think once you understand these three dynamics, by the way, which no one wants to really teach you, because then it removes the veil of the nonsense, is one dynamic is the establishment, right? Those people want to keep things as they are. Then you have on the other side, change agents. And change agents are typically not perfect. They don't speak the right way. They don't have beautiful scripts and political consultants. They're people who march in the streets to get women's rights, people's names we don't even know about. Civil rights, it wasn't Martin Luther King, sorry. It was people's names we don't know about. Those people are the change agents. And in the middle of that, you have the third group, which is probably the more insidious group, who I call the not so obvious establishment. And if you look at this past election, what's amazing to learn from this, when you look at someone like Romney or the Bushes, is that the establishment congealed around Hillary Clinton. So you had the Romneys, the Bushes, the Obamas, and the Clintons all came together because they were so afraid of a change agent called Donald Trump, who was speaking to everyday Americans who were forgotten. And the liberals don't want to talk about this, or even the quote unquote conservatives like John McCain or Mitt Romney, because Trump hit a dog whistle when he started talking about the forgotten man. You know, no one was addressing the issue of poor whites. The elites in Hollywood and the elites at, you know, on the East Coast thought these guys are quote unquote rednecks or stupid, but they had fundamental issues that were not being addressed. So those were the changes, and that was represented by Donald Trump. Now, what's really amazing to watch is in the midst of that, you have someone like Bernie Sanders shows up. He's a not so obvious establishment. He's the recurrent nonsense that takes place in American history, who suck the energy, the anger, the passion out of the anti-establishment forces on the street and tell them, oh, vote for me and I'll give you a better day. And what did he do? He brought all of his votes back to Hillary Clinton. I had a lot of my friends saying, hey, you should vote for Bernie. I said, look, he's going to do is exactly what Jesse Jackson did in 1984. He sold out to Walter Mondale, claiming, you know, Reagan was this awful thing. And it's a lesser of two evils model. And I think the historic opportunity we have right now, Sticks, is that people are tired of this lesser of two evil model. And what better place to destroy that than Massachusetts? And I think that's the historic opportunity here. And I think what better candidate than myself, who's gone through the American journey in many ways, who embodies the American dream. And, you know, I've fulfilled all the promise, you know, or honored this country. So I think that's what the opportunity is. So someone like a Mitt Romney is part of that establishment. You see, here's a guy, Bain Capital, came from that essential, you know, legacy admissions model to Harvard, right? If you really trace his background, here's a guy who made $700 million flipping methadone clinics, right? So this is part of the swamp economy, right? You see an opportunity, you aggregate methadone clinics and you flip them. He, you know, the guy basically moves around money, but really has never really created anything himself. And one should wonder, could he ever create anything if he ever came from not the Romney family? But that's what Mitt Romney is. He's part of the swamp, part of the sewer, in fact, that feeds the swamp.
So you would consider yourself one of those who want to drain the swamp over time. Now, I personally think if you self-identified as a liberal, probably instead of taking flack on saying, well, you know, I developed the term email and I went to MIT and I'm trying to run for office, I think you'd be considered a genius within the Democratic Party, to tell the truth, for partisan reasons. Would there be any truth to it if I were to ask this? Were you at any time a liberal and then you realized that the left was messed up, or were you independent to begin with? Like in your political journey, what meanderings did your political journey take you?
It's a great question. Look, if you talk to my friends who knew me when I was a 18-year-old kid burning the South African flag on the steps of MIT after having led one of the biggest protests, and exposing MIT and the liberal hypocrisy of MIT, they say Shiva hasn't changed. If anything, my anger and my passion against the establishment has accelerated. People say, you know, you calm down, but I haven't. I've learned more, and in fact, I'm more disgusted with the establishment. So my politics, because of, you know, it's hard for each one of us to walk in anyone's shoes, Sticks, but my journey as a kid who grew up in the caste system of India. Think about it. You had the priesthood, you had the kings, you know, whatever, the politicians, you had the business people, and then there were the Shudras, like the N-word, right? So by any, you know, chance, there's not a lot of Indians like me in America. My parents should never have even made it here, but they're extraordinary people for who they are, fighters at the end of the day. So I consider me being able to come to America an extraordinary opportunity. Everything else is icing on the cake. And I believe, Sticks, that I owe not only to those people in India, but every other working American, because I identify with them at a very fundamental level. You see, that's what moves me. I've been very fortunate to get all this education, but I see them as weapons in the fight against the establishment. And if I don't use them, then I'm essentially, you know, a waste, right? So I see my journey as a small slice in this long arc of fighting the establishment. So if anything, I've always been anti-establishment, because as a kid, when I saw that I was given water in a different cup, right? As a 5-year-old, I had to start asking fundamental questions. When I went through the journey, as I saw segregation in this country, as I saw even at MIT, an institution which claimed to be a liberal institution, but the contradictions that MIT held, right? Here they're talking about they're against, racism and oppression, yet they treat their own food service workers horribly, and they, feed kids trash in the student cafeteria. You see what I'm saying? So these contradictions have never gone away from me, and the desire not to fight them has never gone away. So if anything, I've been anti-establishment, if anything, a revolutionary at best, and that theme has not changed. So I never thought I would ever participate in conventional politics. But when Trump won, after I saw Jesse Jackson sell out in '84, I said, F both of these parties. But when Trump won, here was a guy who was attacking the media, attacking the establishment, right? And he was using that platform. He didn't sell out. And whatever reason he did it for, it's irrelevant. But he did a historic duty to the American people by using that platform to hammer away. If he doesn't even pass one bill, it's irrelevant to me. The fact that he used that platform to do that, that is huge. And he's done a historic duty for people. And this truth, the liberals do not want to understand, because they are fundamentally bourgeois oppressors, part of the establishment, right? And they're more insidious than what they would call the quote unquote right wing oppressor. So I've essentially been anti-establishment, sort of the short of it. And I think we have a huge opportunity with Elizabeth Warren, because she is the face of the deep state. She is the face of the not so obvious establishment. She's a fake fighter. She's a fake Indian.